Welcome everyone. I'm Michele Gold, Board Chair at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you all for joining us today for the discussion with Dr. Lisa Gruenberg, author of My City of Dreams. In her book, she is confronted with her elderly father's flashbacks and begins to inhabit the story of his sister Mia, who disappeared in Germany in 1941. After her father's death in 2005, Gruenberg traveled to Vienna, Germany, and Israel to explore this lost landscape and to trace the fates of Mia, their extended family, their friends, and neighbors. She wove her own story with theirs, linking them together with photographs, archival and primary source material, family letters, diaries, her father's writing, his genealogy research, and the joyful tales he told her long ago. We will hear from Lisa in a moment, but first, if I may, let me tell you a little bit about our museum. Holocaust Museum LA is the first Holocaust museum in the United States, founded by survivors in 1961 who wanted to create a safe place to display their precious artifacts in perpetuity and to remember their family members and their loved ones who had perished. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students and visitors from across Los Angeles, the United States, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founding survivors to commemorate, educate, and to inspire. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's at no charge. So if you are enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by going to holocaustmuseumla.org and to make a donation. At the end of this program and Lisa's presentation, we will have time for questions, so please type any questions that you have in the Q&A box. It is now my pleasure, and indeed it's my privilege, to introduce Lisa Gruenberg. Lisa is a physician, medical educator, and writer based in Boston. Her essays have been published in Plowshares, Vital Signs, Hospital Drive, The Intima, a journal of narrative medicine, and the Michigan Quarterly Review. Her short story, Keskama, won the 2012 Artist Fellowship from Massachusetts Cultural Council. Her first book, My City of Dreams, was published in September of 2019 by Cambridge-based Tidepole Press. Lisa, thank you so much for being with us today, and we welcome you.
Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
I'm going to just introduce the book and do a very short reading and show you some of the photographs and documents that really enrich the story. Then we're going to turn it over to you to ask questions or tell us a little bit about your experiences. So the book starts joyfully, much as my father begins in the first and only chapter of his memoir, his unfinished memoir. And it begins with a famous song from that time, which encapsulates his feeling about the city he grew up in, Vienna, and the city he went back and visited many times as a tourist after the war. Vienna, Vienna, only you will always be the city of my dreams. In spite of the hardships my family experienced and the times when there was not enough money for food, I feel I had a very happy childhood. And most of all, I was in love with Vienna. My father would flee Vienna at the age of 18. He would, by himself, leaving behind his parents, his younger brother Uri, and his sister Mia. He went to England, where he was allowed to work on a Zionist farm, training to become a pioneer in Palestine. He was arrested in 1940, summer of 1940, by the British, who were afraid of spies. He was interned on the Isle of Man, imprisoned in a dilapidated seaside hotel surrounded by barbed wire. He would be shipped out at the end of the summer of 1940 to Canada, where he was imprisoned in POW camps until the end of 1941. His stories from growing up in Vienna and from those times when he was imprisoned were joyful stories, and were missing many of the people, his large extended family, that populated his early stories about his life. Many of those people would vanish, would be murdered. His parents murdered, his sister disappearing in 1941. He thought to a place called Magdeburg in Germany. I start my memoir with this same song, with this same joyful story, because that's what I grew up with. Even though I knew this was a very sad story, I bought into his version of it. The story begins, I'm middle-aged, my father's elderly, he's retired, and he's suffering from Parkinson's disease. And he begins to have flashbacks about events that happened before he left Vienna. And he begins to have a recurring nightmare about being buried alive, which turns out to be probably or possibly the manner in which his parents died. It becomes clear that Mia may have undergone that same fate. That confused him because he thought she'd gone to Germany and was gassed at Auschwitz. After one particularly bad flashback, I decide to videotape my father and ask him about his sister. Now, when I was growing up, my father didn't say his sister's name out loud. He really rarely spoke about her, and if I asked about her, he always described her as my sister. Sometimes he substituted my cousin's name. His brother's Uri, who escaped to Palestine when he was 15, had 2 daughters, and one of them was named Maya, same spelling. Sometimes he called her by my name, and when he told me stories about her when I was growing up, it was always, she was like you, she was pretty, she was smart, she had a good sense of humor, nothing specific. And when I was videotaping him, he suddenly, I said, can you just tell me some specific story about her? He suddenly said her name out loud, Mia, and hadn't realized he'd never said it before. And when I asked him to tell me something specific about her again, he said, and his eyes filled with tears, I simply can't remember anything about her. And I began to wonder, did my father really love me? Or did I simply occupy a void that Mia had left behind? I'm a physician and I don't believe in the supernatural, but after this revelation, I was suffering from depression and insomnia, and I woke in the middle of the night, and she spoke to me. She presents the mystery of her disappearance. Did she go to Magdeburg in Germany? Was she gassed at Auschwitz? Was she forced into prostitution? Did she somehow return to Vienna to be deported with her parents in 1942? I began to write down her words. I was not a writer at that time, but I was compelled to write down what she told me. After my father's death, I had dozens of family letters translated, and it became clear to me how close they really were. I journeyed to Vienna in Germany to trace her fate and the fate of extended family, neighbors, and friends. I wove this story with Mia's, my father's outbursts, his writing and genealogy research, with primary source documents, photographs, family memoirs, and those tales he told me long ago. I tell Mia's story in her voice, first having her inhabit his stories from childhood, then using her letters to my father and to her brother, my uncle, from 1939 to 41, and then using my imagination and research to fill in her journey from there. A close friend of mine told me the story is a love story, and I think that's true. I started the book thinking there was this void at the center of my father's love. I ended it with understanding that that void was filled with yearning, yearning for connection and for those people we've lost. I want to just thank Tide Pool Press, who took what I think was a good manuscript and turned it into a work of art. Ingrid Mack, the book designer. I'm going to briefly show you some slides before I do the reading. Really did a masterful job of pulling in more documents than I had originally in the book and making it a visual, I think, masterpiece. So that's the cover of the book. I was telling Michele beforehand, this is a postcard from Vienna sent in the 30s that my editor, Frank Herron, found, and Ingrid colorized. It's a picture of the Prater in Vienna. This is my father's family. You can see my father, my Uncle Ori, Mia, and my grandparents, Leo and Elka. This picture was taken in 1938. Mia would have been 12. She looks a good deal older. Just to give you a sense of the documents that are left, this is police documentation. There was one for every member of my father's family stating that she left. The date on this is incorrect. There was not a deportation on April 27th. And the forms are very bureaucratic. It says she was basically canceled to Minsk. This is just another document that enriches the story. Part of this story tells about Mia and my father's aunt, Pepe, who tried to commit suicide in 1942. And this is her admission note to a mental institution that was written by Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. This is a document. It's amazing how many documents are still intact in Vienna. They haven't destroyed those documents. It's very unusual to find documents from Germany from this time, but this is a list showing Mia where she was sent to, as a slave laborer, one of 150 girls. She was sent with this group of girls to a place called Gruenberg in Magdeburg province in Germany. Another document from the day my grandparents were deported with a list of their belongings. My grandfather signs it at the bottom. Things like pots and pans, chairs, a table, 75 marks, as if they were going to retrieve these items when they came back. This is a document showing the deportation. The mystery of, was Mia with them at the end? She's listed, my father always thought they were taken in a cattle car. They were in fact taken on a passenger train with assigned seats, thinking they were being relocated. I show this picture. There's pictures in the book, and people have contacted me because they happen to know other people in the book. This is Mia, my father, Ori, and a friend and neighbor who somebody contacted me and let me know that they knew her. Again, sort of a picture of family of 5 and sort of the similarity, 2 brothers and a daughter. You can kind of see why my father conflated us. That's me at 16. And this is a picture of the Youth Aliyah school. On the far right is a girl who looks very similar to me. I could never confirm if that was her. This was the Jewish school she attended before she was sent to Germany in 1941. I'm going to leave that up there as I do the reading, and it's very short. Mia meets a boy on the banks of the Danube to say goodbye. She's 15 years old, and she's being deported to Magdeburg province in Germany to harvest the asparagus in the spring of 1941. Jews are limited to 1 ration card per family, so everyone is starving. Throughout the book, I incorporate my father's experiences and his friends into Mia's stories. He used to tell me about swimming in the Danube and being caught up by the current. I imagined the river was a crystalline blue, which couldn't be further from the truth. The boy in this story is based on a young man my father remembered, named Borscht because of the color of his hair, which was the bright color of beet soup. He recalled that he often was targeted by fascists because of his bright hair. And the boy has mannerisms that are common to my husband as a young man. So there are echoes with my current story as well. And of course, Mia takes on some of my experiences, both as a young woman and also parts of my own story as I interview survivors who might have known her and as I move through her landscape in search of her. The boulevards of the 2nd District are empty, but I avoid them anyway. I walk north and west, divining a way through narrow streets and alleys toward the fields along the broad Donau. The tall grass rustles, and he stands next to me, thick hair off his thin face. A bruise marks his left cheek, and I see the muscle twitch below it. As the sun elevates, the downy hair on his face glints. Behind him, the river slides by like the back of a lazy snake. I pull my dress over my head and lean over to unbuckle my shoes. I fold my dress and put it next to the trunk of an oak. I unclasp my locket with my brother's pictures within and put it inside my shoe. I walk to him in my slip, feeling damp air on my arms. I unbutton his shirt and help him pull it off. Keeping my eyes on his, I fold the shirt and lay it down with my dress. He sits down in the tall grass and yanks at his shoes. His lungs draw on the skin between his ribs. He stands again, and I take his hand and lead him to the water. Our feet sink into mud and the river swirls around us. He puts his hands on the side of my face, then kisses me on the forehead, and then moves down to my lips. His tongue is sweet and salty. I lie back and wrap my legs around his waist and smile to the sky. His hand moves under my slip and along the concave surface of my stomach. The river lifts me, and I unlock my grip. I hover next to him for a moment. Mia, he cries as I slip away. The sound of my name wakes me as if from a dream. I flip over and throw my arms out and try to grab his outstretched hands, but the current drags me out. I fight a little, but I don't have the strength I had when I swam here with Martin and my brothers. I float beyond a bend, and the sound of my name becomes the sound of the waves hitting the banks. I lie back and let myself drift into the center of the river. Clouds roll over me, and hunger and time fall away. I am like a bird caught in a warm updraft, suspended over an ocean of sky. Buildings line up on the water's edge. The sun moves behind a cloud and the air around me chills. I sense the Reichsbridge is accelerating toward me, and I am falling toward it, as if back to earth. If I smash into one of the buttresses, I will die instantly. But if I go through the arches, then the whirlpool beyond will drag me under and drown me. I pull myself upright and tread water. Soldiers run onto the bridge. I aim for the wall of stone between the arches, then lie back again and close my eyes. The soldiers' voices are above me, shouting, "It's a woman, a woman." I open my eyes again and see their faces in a line peering over the railing. I see the girders of the bridge as I shoot through. On the other side, their faces hang over, open mouthed. The weight of the water sweeps me around, and it looks like their heads snap upside down, and then they vanish as I'm pulled under and far below. I'm just going to show you 2 more pictures, and then I'm going to stop. Just in the hopes that somebody in the audience might know somebody in these pictures. I'm particularly interested in a girl named Susie. My father remembered her as the younger sister of neighbors. The Harbans, Paul and his mother, Stephanie managed to get to San Francisco in late 39. But Susie's not mentioned in any of the documents or in any of the research I could find. I'm wondering if my father confused her with another Susie, a Susie Sharfstein, who's mentioned in the letters, whose family were on the ill-fated St. Louis that got sent to Cuba and then turned back to New York, letting some passengers off, but others not. My father thought this little girl might be Susie, but it's also possible it's this one. And I'm just interested because I see this little girl who looks very much like that second girl in the other picture. And that's a photograph from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum from an exhibit on the St. Louis. So I just share that. And I turn it back to Michele.
Thank you, Lisa. That was your reading was really very, very moving. And before we get to the questions here, and as you asked, does anyone know anyone in the picture that you shared with us all? One of our listeners by the name of Dave Abbey said he believed he knew you when your families were neighbors in Ottawa in the 90s.
Oh my goodness.
So he's listening.
Oh my goodness, David, how did you get on this? That's wonderful.
Okay.
Yes, I was born in Ottawa, and my dad had gone to Caltech, but was unable to stay in the United States afterwards. And he was married to my mother, who's he met in Vancouver when he was released from the POW camps, and was at university there. And so they ended up going to National Research Council. My dad worked there in Ottawa until he got permission to come back to the States.
It truly was a beautiful, beautiful reading. I do have a few questions that are popping up here, and that is, how did you conduct your research?
Well, I had the advantage of having my father's genealogy research, which interestingly focused a lot on people from a few generations earlier. Mia didn't have her own page, and my uncle only had half a page, but he might have 2 or 3 pages on his grandfather or great-grandfather or other people. So that's where I began. A lot of people died, but some people survived. My dad, people knew he was looking for family. And it wasn't until he died and I went through his documents that I realized he was trying to trace what happened to Mia. How did she go to Germany? As he thought his father wrote in a letter, did she actually not go to Germany, or did she somehow come back? So there were a lot of things that he wrote about and was looking for that I only discovered after he died, unfortunately. And I had never gone to Vienna. I had never wanted to go there. The place terrified me. So I didn't go till after he died. And actually, there are a lot of archives in Vienna, probably about 20. And I tried contacting people, and a lot of times nobody responded. Nobody responded to letters or emails or phone calls. But you would get there and you would start, people would say they had nothing for you, and you would start talking to people, and suddenly they would get interested and they would find things for you. So a lot of the story is kind of a detective story. It was originally called Searching for Mia, and I spent a lot of times online and just nagging people to try to trace her. And then I had help in Vienna. Eventually, the archives in Germany were, because this was the former East Germany, a little bit hard to deal with. And Germany also doesn't like to release documents. If there's a chance that anybody mentioned the document is still alive, they say that's a privacy issue, or at least at the time I was doing the research. So that actually took a lot of persistence. And a lot of the documents from that time were destroyed either by the Nazis or destroyed in Germany or destroyed during the firebombing at the end of the war. So there isn't a lot left. My father also, when I went through his closets after he died, and my mother, who's not Jewish, was not really into all this. So she let me take everything that was there. It turned out every relative, children of survivors, few that there were, sent everything they had to my father. So he had boxes and boxes of photographs and documents documenting like his, one of his uncles dying at Buchenwald, his death certificate. And he had stuff still coming in from Poland, where his family was from, after his death, things, just tons of documents. So I had all that. But I don't speak German. I speak a little bit, but I had to use translators.
So one of our listeners has asked a question. I've got a slew of questions for you, actually. One here is, how long did it take you to write the book, and how much travel was involved with the book?
There's a lot of time travel. There's a lot of journeys. But actual travel, I spent probably 3 weeks total in Vienna. And I spent time, I went to school for a couple of years in Israel. So I had quite a lot of connections in Israel. As far as writing the book, I was not a writer. So I started getting these flashes. I guess it's inspiration or being visited by someone, which is hard to admit. But I was probably a little not mentally in great shape. So I think I was just channeling this stuff and writing it down. And a lot of that stuff stayed in the book. Mia's voice very much stayed in the book. But then I realized I'd taken one English class in college, and even though I loved books, I didn't really know how to write one. So this was probably 2004 when my dad had his last flashback, which was about a man urinating on a Jew in the street after the Anschluss. And it was a very graphic, disturbing story that I hadn't heard before. That's when I started writing. So that was 2004. And that's a few months later, actually, when I stopped writing because I just found it so difficult and painful. And then I decided to apply for an MFA, which I got into based on this just what I would call inspired writing. And that's when I realized writing is not about being inspired. Writing is about just sitting down and writing really terrible, terrible, endless first drafts. And that, so the whole process, I finished the book, the first draft of the book in 2008. So that was 5 years, and tried to market it, got nowhere, rewrote it, started writing some other things, some fiction and essays. And then I had a couple offers from publishers that then backed out, and I decided to rewrite it for myself and self-publish. And that's when Tide Pool came into the picture. I had an editor who, Jessamine Hope, who wrote a book called Safekeeping, just really guided me through trying to write a book that people could actually understand, that wasn't so much time travel that people got lost. And once I had that, then Tide Pool, I had pulled out most of the photographs and documents, and then Tide Pool put those all back in and made this kind of collage book that's a combination of illustrations and story, poetry and fiction and memoir. So published in 2019. So that took a long time.
A long time.
Yeah.
You know, when you mentioned the Anschluss, it always makes me think about the scene in Vienna where you have this image of Viennese Jews being forced to scrub the graffiti off the streets, which happened after Anschluss. And when I think of that, and of course you have this image in your book as well, of the image of Jews being forced to get on their knees and scrub, I think with a toothbrush in some instances, they were forced to be degraded in such a incredible, demeaning way. So which brings me to the question that I have here, and that is, how did your father feel when he returned to visit Vienna?
I don't know, because I never went with him. My cousins went with him once. He would do slideshows. I mean, he went back for the first time in I think it was 1963, after he obtained his US citizenship, which was a struggle. He went back with my mother, and they probably made 5 or 6 trips there. And it very much looks like tourists. I mean, the pictures are of them doing tourist things, eating pastries and going to the parks, and my mother on the Riesenrad, on the Ferris wheel and the Prater, and things like that. My father had one surviving cousin in Vienna, Martin, and Martin Gruenberg was a communist, the only son of my grandfather's youngest brother. They had escaped to Russia in 1934 when the fascists took over, and came back in 46 and 48, and were ardent communists. And my father had a lot of trouble. I mean, they argued a lot. And it was very painful for my father, because this was his favorite cousin and the only surviving cousin. So, yeah, I think it was very much a disconnect. Most people who were from Vienna, who lived through the Anschluss and Kristallnacht, they don't go back, or they might go back once, and then it's so painful because people just live on as if nothing ever happened there. But I think my father compartmentalized this experience and just until his flashbacks came. I think he saw Vienna very much as the place he grew up, a wonderful place.
So, as a physician, how did you balance your writing journey as a practicing physician? How did you balance the two?
I didn't balance them at all. So that's part of the reason it took me so long to write the book. And when I started writing, I was working part-time, and then I took a leave because of family issues, some of which I talk about in the book. And I started doing teaching at Harvard Medical School, which was my hospital is affiliated with Harvard Med. So that's when I started teaching, and I started doing volunteer medicine. And I went back to paid clinical practice in 2010, after the book was essentially finished. And it was always something I worked around the edges. I had long stretches where I worked on it continuously, and then long stretches where I didn't write anything. So it was never a good balance. There was always too much going on, but I think the story itself, the obligation to write this book, I felt very strongly. Oops, somebody's peeking in.
What kind of medicine did you practice is one of our listeners. What kind of medicine did you practice, and did your dreams with Mia change how you treat your patients?
I think writing and certainly my father's experiences with Parkinson's and these flashbacks changed a lot about the way I practice medicine. I stopped delivering babies in 97, so sort of a few years before, and I was just a practicing gynecologist when I started writing the story. After that, I did mostly office GYN. I did 5 years as a pediatric and adolescent gynecologist at Boston Children's Hospital. And then I worked in a clinic, and I was telling Michele, currently I'm sort of semi-retired. I do volunteer medicine. Part of the time I'm signed up as a volunteer physician in Colorado, but we have a grandson with medical problems that we spend a lot of time taking care of, and with COVID, I've just been teaching remotely at Harvard. I haven't been seeing patients.
And a few questions the same here is, what made you decide to write the book?
Well, I think I tried to explain that at the beginning, but really I think just I knew my father was writing this memoir, which either it's on some floppy disk I can't find, but he never seemed to have gotten past the first chapter, and which was a little superficial, and just a lot of the stories that I heard really growing up. I won't say sanitized, it's just not the people I'm really interested in hearing about, like his sister, are not really in the book. So I think the drive really came from feeling like I had this visitation from her. And I wanted to tell, initially she was telling my father's story in her words. And then I realized it wasn't really a story about Mia, although she's a very, very important piece of the story. And we do kind of at the end of the book come together. She speaks in present tense. I speak in past tense until the end of the book, when we basically merge. We alternate voices, and then I'm in the present tense at the end of the book. But I think it was really, that was the drive, was writing about her. And then I think there were other things going on in my life that I was writing about, that just felt very compelling. And then it became sort of part of who I am. But I didn't define myself as a writer for a very long time.
The photo that you shared with us of Mia at the age of 16, you look so like her.
Well, that's the question, though. I have not confirmed that it's her.
Yeah.
But I think there is.
And there's the photo of her age 12, you look very much like her as well.
Well, that's interesting you'd say that, because my father felt there was a very definite resemblance. My uncle Uri couldn't see it. He also never said her name out loud. My father's cousin Martin, who I finally met in 2006 when he was in his 80s after my dad died, he looked at me and says, I don't see it. And then I finally, at the end of the book, there is a passport photograph of Mia where I don't think she looks anything like me. So I don't know if that's her, but I have to think it's possible because of the resemblance.
One question I have for you is from one of our audiences that her name is Jenny. She's interested in whether your mother held many stories from your father that he hadn't told you. And the second part of her question is, did he use Mia's name with her?
No. So my mother's not Jewish. They met, my dad in 43, he tried to go to the United States to join an uncle who'd gotten out via Shanghai. Shanghai was a free port. So people who had money could travel from Vienna to Shanghai, and then from Shanghai maybe get to the United States, which is Uncle Menyo. This is my father's favorite uncle, did end up with his wife in Salt Lake City. They had sponsors there, but they could not get my father from Canada to them because he was considered an enemy alien. So they found him a sponsor in Vancouver. My father was put on a train, went to Vancouver, and he worked as a janitor, and then worked in a factory. And then when he was imprisoned with a bunch of professors in the POW camps, and they had run a camp school, so he had 2 years of university. They'd given him a camp diploma, and so he took that and he talked his way into University of British Columbia. His roommate, Mel Juleson, was engaged to my mother's sister, and they brought my dad home in Christmas of 1943. There's a picture of my father and mother, my aunt and uncle sitting on a couch in front of a Christmas tree. That's my dad's first Christmas and his first meeting with my mother. And my mother decided she was going to marry him just about then. He took a little while to come around to the idea. So my mother's now 99,
wow,
going on 100. She has read this book like 5 times. She did not like the idea of my writing about it, and she didn't like the way she was portrayed in the original drafts that she snuck. I actually never gave it to her. She snuck from my brother, my oldest brother. And she complained about some of the things in the book. What's happened, though, is she's really, she loves the book. She talks about it all the time. And she feels very sad because she didn't want to hear these stories. She didn't register how Mia may have actually died. And she didn't register that that's how her name was pronounced until after she read the book. I don't think she felt like the past is past. That's how you move on. She didn't have an easy childhood herself. The things she did tell me were that after he died, she told me that he told her he only married her to forget what had happened. Now, he denied ever saying that after David was born, my oldest brother, but my mother remembers that quite clearly. And that was hard.
Yes, that must have been very difficult.
Yeah.
How does your story correlate with the current times?
I think there's a lot of ways that it correlates. I think one thing I took out of the book, and I'm trying to put it into fiction, was it's a little bit in the book, is about growing up in a neighborhood that was integrated in the early 60s. And the Black family that moved onto the street, the daughters, I'm still friends with one of the daughters, very close friends. But I didn't want to play with those girls because most of the families on the street were either they were trying to buy back the house so that the neighborhood wouldn't integrate, and they didn't want their kids playing with those girls. And my parents made us go over and meet them and made us go play with them. And I just remembered I didn't want to do it. I wanted to be with my friends. And that's sort of the insidiousness of prejudice and sort of fear of the other that I think still exists in this country. And my father saw that very clearly. But if I didn't have a parent to say, this is what you have to do, this is the right thing to do, I would have stayed with my friends. So I think it plays into what's going on in this country around fear of the other, or fear of groups, or fear of immigrants, or whatever it is. I think it's still very much with us, sadly. It's part of human nature. And it takes a conscious effort to battle it. I ended up taking a lot of that piece of the story out because the book was getting way too long. But I do want to write about that.
Let me read you one of our listeners. They write, Lisa, thank you so much for creating this work of art on so many levels. Listening to you describe your father's early experiences brought me to tears. Knowing your father as I was growing up and spending time with Uri in Israel, and it's from Anne Goldblatt.
Oh.
In Israel as a young adult, I realized how little I knew about their past, but you have reinforced the significance of learning one's own family history.
Thank you.
What a beautiful thing to say.
Yes.
Dave Abbey says he has also kept, I also have kept regularly in touch with David, mostly to tell him, David tells me your mother is still alive. Is this correct? Okay, okay.
Very much so, yeah.
Okay, all right. So is there anything else is there any message you would like to leave with our many, many listeners today?
I would just say I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak here at the museum. I don't know how many people out there are just friends and family. But if you have a chance in Los Angeles to go to the museum, I was privileged to go when Michele was presenting her first book, I understand. And there was an exhibit on the Danes and the Jews of Denmark in their flight from Denmark to Sweden. And it was an amazing, amazing exhibit. The photographs were just really stunning. And I think the space is very evocative. And I think the programs are really valuable. So I hope that the museum will open soon, that the pandemic will come under control, maybe, who knows, maybe this summer.
To all of us. And Lisa, we're so thrilled that we're finally able to host you. I cannot tell you cannot tell you, your book is beautifully written. It's full of compassion. It's heartfelt. And we thank you profusely. We really, really do. Thank you for being with us. And for all our listeners, you can purchase Lisa's book online at Amazon.com. It's also a Kindle book. Anything you'd like to add to that? Amazon.com.
You can look at my website. There's some local bookstores that carry it, depending on where you are. And the Audible book should be out soon.
Okay. So thank you so much again, and it was an absolute privilege to have you speak with us. I found it very, very moving, and everything you've said is very moving. And I have a lot of, I think we have a lot of connection in that way with my own family history, and we really, really do thank you. Before we sign off, I do want to invite everyone to join us next Tuesday, December 1st at 11 a.m. Pacific, as we mark World Kindertransport Day by speaking with Kindertransport survivor Paul Kester and Barbara Winton. Barbara Winton is the daughter of Kindertransport rescuer Sir Nicholas Winton, who arranged safe transportation of 669 children from Czechoslovakia to Great Britain. You can find more information about all of our virtual events on our website, holocaustmuseumla.org. So thank you again to Lisa and to everyone for joining us today. Take good care. Happy Thanksgiving, a safe Thanksgiving, a healthy one, and hopefully we will see you all again soon. Take care and goodbye. And Lisa, a huge thank you to you. Bye-bye then.
Thank you so much. Thank you.